Sullivan, so stay with the conversation at home. It's hashtag LP15. Now, we've got some tweets in, and I didn't pay for this one, Sam Ryan, but thank you very, very much. Nora Casey doing a stellar job of moderating this discussion. Gavin Duffy, my fellow dragon, glad to see you're up, Gavin. As a business person, want to publicly express my appreciation for the Labour Party for playing its part in turning the country around. Emer Costello, who I happen to know is married to Joe Costello, and might be a sister of Mary Moran, because she says Mary Moran highlights the importance of government commitment to increasing special needs assistance, and she did. Conor Riley, huge strides made by Ministers Quinn and O'Sullivan in the area of school buildings. Moving away from prefabs provides equality. Now we're going to go on a time warp. We're going to catapult you into Budget 2016. We're going to talk about raising living standards between now and then. And I have some new faces again joining me on stage. Ministers Alan Kelly, Jed Nash and Sean Sherlock. Deputies Emmett Stagg, Robert Dowds, Eamon Maloney, Michael McNamara, Sean Kenny and Michael McCarthy. Senator Aideen Hayden and party chairperson who's been running the show here, Lorraine Mulligan. You're all very welcome. So, to kickstart the conversation, let's take another question from the floor. Over to you, Jerry Kerr.
Thanks
Dublin
very
North
much,
West.
Nora. Rent regulation, Nora. As we all know, rents in Ireland, particularly in Dublin, have gone, pardon the pun, through the roof. We have a terrific... Nobody laughed at that, I don't... It must be so serious. Okay. As we know, we have a terrific social housing programme introduced by Labour, 40,000 houses by 2020. Should we not now, in tandem with that, introduce rent regulation as a core policy to protect those who are renting and to prevent landlords from profiteering?
Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you.
It's going to obviously move to you, Alan Kelly, first of all, because you've got all the money.
Yeah.
But secondly, Jerry's got a point. I mean, 2020, it's fantastic news and it's brilliant, but between now and then, rents have gone through the roof, as he said, and he didn't get a laugh either.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, a priority issue for me. When I took over the department, we had issues in relation to social housing, which, with the help of Brendan Howlin and others, we have found funding to develop the largest social housing programme in the history of the state. And may I add, it is always the Labour Party who builds social housing in this country. Traditionally, it always has been. We had certainly a crisis in homelessness that needs continued attention. We have brought in the first ever climate change bill in the history of the state. There was a party that groomed themselves on green issues that were in government for 4 years. They couldn't do it. We've done it. It's the first time ever. And we've had a range of other issues that we've had to address as well. But I want to say this quite clearly. This, as regards my role in government, is now the #1 priority. We cannot continue with the situation whereby landlords can think that they can increase rents at the level of which, in some cases they are, particularly in the conurbation around Dublin and in large urban areas as well.
And what's the solution, I suppose?
Well,
my old boss used to say, don't bring me problems, give me solutions.
Well, the solution is, as I committed earlier on to all my colleagues here this morning, is that for a period of time we need to look at entering the market. We need to look at a new framework for rent. And we need to provide, and I will provide, regulations or indeed legislation or ministerial orders in order to do that. I don't think it's something that we have to do long term, but in the short term, next 3 to 4 years, as the housing supply is developed through the strategy which I spoke about earlier, we need other methods to address the rental issue in this country, because we cannot continue the way we're going.
Okay, thank you. Emmett, the nice thing about having such a wide and diverse panel, changing all the time, is I get to talk to people like you, who have been, can I say you've been around the block a little bit?
Around the block, yeah.
And you could teach maybe Mr. Kelly a thing or two.
I'm going to go around the block a few more times as well.
I'm talking about your wisdom to date rather than the one that you're going to gain in the future. So you live in a council house, you're quite proud of it, and you also have vast experience in housing. So any advice for the relatively young Minister Kelly here?
I'm very glad to hear what Alan has just said about the attempt to control rents. Really, we got into the crisis we're in now because Fianna Fáil actually decided to privatise social housing and to throw the social tenants to the slim mercies of the private landlords and to give a rent subsidy. for that. I think presently, Alan will confirm this, I think it's something, comes through Jones' department, about 450 million a year in subsidies are paid to private landlords to subsidise the rents they receive from their tenants. That's a huge amount of money. But that was the decision that Fianna Fáil took. Now, trying to reverse that is a huge job. And Alan has succeeded in actually putting together a financial package that will give us a real building programme. Now, the building programme literally stopped. They had an attempt at Power 5, which was useless. It didn't work. There were small amounts of money went into councils from that, but really very few housing units. And as a result, nearly all of the 6,000 families in my constituency who are on the housing list in Kildare are in receipt of rent subsidy. And we now find, and this is I think what Jerry is saying, we now find that landlords can put people out on the road if they want to sell their house, if they want to move into the house themselves, or if the bank wants to sell the house. Now, some or all of these things happen, but they can say it's happening, and I think that happens regularly. My clinics are literally full every week of people who are being threatened with eviction by landlords because they can get a higher rent in the private sector now than they get through the social system.
So are you a fan of the legislation, perhaps?
I'd be very strongly supportive of what Alan has just said about rent control and legislation, and also ensuring that people can't be refused rent simply because they'll be on rent subsidy, and that's happening as well now.
And I'm going to stay involved in the conversation because I want to go to Aidan Hayden, because you chair Threshold, Aidan, I can just see you there. You see some of the most vulnerable people in society, and so what Emmett says is true. I mean, there's 1 in 5 people living in rented accommodation, and a sizable proportion, I think a third, are in rent subsidy. So what kind of things do you see in terms of the problems?
Well, I think there's a truth. 1 in 5 families are actually living in rented accommodation in Ireland. It's 1 in 3 in Galway, and it's 1 in 4 in Dublin. That's a higher proportion than we had since the 1950s. It's a reality. And the irony of it is a lot of conversation happened about the rented sector when the central bank introduced regulation on mortgage lending. And suddenly people realised, I'm going to be renting for the next 10 years. It's not going to be 2 years or 3 years or a few years or whatever until I move on. I'm here for the foreseeable future. And I think a lot of the conversation, as you put it, Nora, has now moved, and people are facing up to this new reality. And there's a couple of issues. One which Emmett raised, which is about low-income households. The fact of the matter is people are losing their homes and they're becoming homeless because they can't afford to pay increased rents. That's a fact. On the other, it is a fact. And, you know, as a civil society, we have to deal with that. It just isn't good enough. And it's not as though we're, you know, rent regulation, as Alan said, is unusual. It's not. Most civilised, no disrespect, European countries have rent regulation. Nobody is suggesting a landlord can't have a reasonable rate of return on their investment. It's about the level of increase. I see every day people with kids. They're putting their kids into a school. They don't know where they're going to be in 12 months' time because they don't know the future they're going to be facing. And until we regulate the rate of rent increases to a reasonable level, and we actually take profiteering out of the system, the market does not work for ordinary people. It does not. And we have got to really get to grips with this issue. It's about saying, what's wrong with the consumer price index? It's 3%. You get a 3% rate, you know.
But the key is putting certainty back into
Absolutely.
people's lives.
It's about certainty. Every day of the week, I have people coming to me and they're saying, look, I got a notice of rent increase. What am I going to do about this? And I'm going, well, what's the rent increase? And they're saying, well, it's 1,300. And the current legislation basically says market. 1,300 is market. That's the fact.
Speaking of market, Aidan, I just want to move to Sean Kenny because you're in Raheny, and you know they're in the northern fringe, and Alan's been talking about going to the market in terms of getting assistance. So you've seen the worst excesses of the Celtic Tiger with Priory Hall and also ghost estates and unfinished estates. So how do we get the balance right?
Well, I welcome what Alan has to say about introducing a new framework.
The microphone, I think. Try again. Yeah.
I welcome what Alan has to say about introducing a new framework for.
Is the year how it now? Yeah.
I welcome what Alan has to say about introducing a new framework for rental sector. As somebody who lived in the rental sector when I was married for over a year, my first son was born when I lived in rented accommodation, so I understand what it is like to aspire to own your own home while you're living in rented accommodation. I think it's the biggest challenge facing the Labour Party, and I'm glad that Alan Kelly is tackling it in the way he is. We do need to introduce some kind of certainty into the private rented sector. I have cases at the moment of people who, at the end of next month, their lease will expire. The landlord is entitled to increase their rent in line with market rents after that. Many of them will not be able to afford to pay this rent. Some of them, unfortunately, do become homeless, and some of the homeless people are people who were not able to afford to continue to pay their rent in the private rented sector. So I think that is the issue that needs to be tackled. You're right about Priory Hall and all of what happened in the North Fringe. Thankfully, building is now beginning to restart in the North Fringe. There is a number of planning applications which have been granted recently. Some of the existing applications which were still live, the building has started. So the building, the construction is beginning to kick in. It needs to move a lot faster. I think that the special vehicles that Alan Kelly has set up to deal with this are needed. But I think it is the greatest challenge facing the Labour Party. In the past, in the 1980s, when we had Labour ministers in environment, the housing crisis in Dublin was substantially solved. In fact, it was for a period in the late 80s, it was easy to get accommodation, local authority accommodation in Dublin as a result of policies that were pursued then. And I think we need to do that again.
We'll get back to it again. And the housing is an incredibly important issue. But we're going to we'll take another question from the floor, actually, just to move the conversation a bit. It's Sylvester Cronin, who works for the trade union SIPTU. Sylvester, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nora. It is evident that the number of jobs being created in the economy is increasing, and that in itself is very positive. However, it would seem that some or a lot of these jobs are what we would normally regard as precarious employment, and where job security and earnings do not contribute much to improvements in living standards or to enhance prosperity for our citizens in general. And I think we could usefully apply this precarious employment to the scenario that was outlined this morning by Letty McCarthy to the imaginary Murphy family, and we would see exactly what the impacts of that would be. So my question is very simple to the panel is, how will Labour deal with this and ensure that a fairer deal for workers and their dependents into the future?
Thanks, Sylvester.
Thank you.
I suppose I'll turn to you first, Minister Ged Nash, because only 2 days ago, to great fanfare, you launched the Low Pay Commission. So, first of all, what is it, how long is it going to take, and what's it going to achieve? And then maybe we'll talk a little bit more about the second part of Sylvester's question there about precarious job opportunities.
Sure. Well, Nora, the Labour Party is the party of work. When we were established in 1912, that was the principle on which we were founded. And I think that principle remains the same today. I obsess, to be frank, about getting people back to work. It's the best way out of poverty. It's the most sustainable way out of poverty. And in this country, we're well on track to achieve full employment by 2018 because of a lot of the measures that the Labour Party has taken in government. I think the establishment of the Low Pay Commission can be transformational for the experience of people who are merely existing on low pay. The first job that I've given the Low Pay Commission is to come back to me with a recommendation on a new rate for the national minimum wage by the middle of July this year. It's important that we have a statutory minimum wage in this country. It can
what are you
lift
going to
people
use
out
for
of
comparisons
poverty.
for that?
Well, for the first time ever in this country, we're going to formally engage with employers and with employee representatives and academics to advise government on what the rate of the national minimum wage should be. I think it's important in terms of public policy making that we do that in an evidence-based way. I've said all along that I would never take a single measure as Minister for Business and Employment that would jeopardise any business's opportunity to create a job, because I believe in work and I believe in the world of work. But it is extremely important that we make sure that work pays and we move people from welfare to work as we move towards full employment.
Can I just ask you, so I read something extraordinary recently that 9% of people who had a single wage earner were living below the poverty line. But also it's not just about the minimum wage, it's also about the amount of hours that people can work. Absolutely,
and we've actually seen from CSO figures published this week, that last year there was effectively a 3% on average pay rise across the private sector, but there's also an increase in hours. So I think that tells us a lot about where the economy is at the moment and gives us confidence and gives me the confidence to reiterate my commitment that 2015 will be the year of the pay rise. That's not to say that there aren't businesses continuing to struggle at the moment, particularly on the SME side.
And Jed, we might come back to that because I know you've got a dual role, and I think there's a juxtaposition between the two. But I wanted to bring in Lorraine, because she's been working very hard here, and she's sitting, I hope, taking a break from running the conference. But you're a researcher with SIPTU, and you probably see the science firsthand. I mean, for instance, this week we saw that the average wage has increased by 2.3%, but it's only in certain areas. So what does the science tell us? What does the research tell us?
Well, certainly in terms of precarious work, the research shows the effects are highly concentrated among women, in particular in the services sector, areas like hospitality, retail, and indeed also young people are affected, and agency workers, which is quite an in-out short-term solution for employers. But importantly, I suppose, for women in the services sector, there are structures there that the Labour Party, in fact, has enabled, called a wonky term, joint labour committees, but these are the structures to set pay. And I think it's important that employers take on their responsibilities to come to the table to negotiate decent rates of pay in that context, which has been facilitated. And in terms of here in the Glen Eagle, we are in a fair hotel, which shows it recognises trade union workers and shows that productivity doesn't have to come at the expense of poor working conditions. There can be a virtuous cycle. We have to encourage the progressive employers who are out there. And there is a second vital component, and that is the enabling legislation now that the Labour Party has secured on collective bargaining. I know people within my family even who have been affected at the workplace by issues, by problems with the boss or problems with your manager. And in my generation, it hasn't been very normal or ordinary to join a trade union. It kind of people just go into the workplace and the opportunity isn't available. And what happens is they might come up against a problem and they have nowhere to go. And now they have a vehicle now through the legislation to have better representation at their workplace.
And I also just wanted to bring in Robert Dadds behind, because you come from, you're Clondalkin, great win with Liffey Valley actually with new jobs. But, is the answer across the board increase? We were just talking to Jed Nash there about that, whether or not that would jeopardise perhaps the recovery in terms of business growth?
It's a real problem. I mean, at the moment, I'm working with some truck drivers who are working for a company that has a dual pay level. It has a higher pay level for people who they took on from a previous company, and then people they've taken in more recently are getting about €1 above the minimum wage, and that has a number of negative consequences. First of all, obviously the second group of people aren't being paid enough, and as a result of that, they're being obliged to work much longer hours than it's really safe for them to do. And remember, in the area of truck driving, you can actually kill people if you make a mistake. Most of us won't kill people if we make a mistake in our work, but for a truck driver, that could be the consequence. So it's very important that those issues are addressed. And the other thing about that is that a great number of the truck drivers they're paying at a lower rate have come in from Eastern Europe. So that's the sort of thing that can fuel disagreements between the indigenous community and the immigrant community, and we want to keep away from that sort of issue.
Stay involved in the conversation, because that's almost the opposite problem to the precarious hours when people are forced to work long hours. Let's take a final question from the floor. Councillor Martina Ganocki from Dublin South West. Thank you.
We know that many people are still hurting as a result of the recession. In the areas of Tallaght and City West, where I represent, we still have some of the highest levels of unemployment in the country, and some working families are struggling to make ends meet or do not have the quality of life they deserve. In the panel's opinion, what tax and welfare measures need to be in Budget 2016 to ensure that everyone feels the recovery?
Thank you, Martina. Well, you're on the hot seat on this one, Sean Sherlock. So my guess is, when Brendan Hallen was sitting here and we were talking about Michael Noonan, and I know this week and last week in particular, the comparisons with Greece are enormous and there was some great wins. But people in Ireland, there are things that are much close to home for them, which is medical cards and child benefit and water charges and property tax. So what do you need to do for people to feel, like, I'm not talking about the macro statistics, but how do you get them to feel that they're part of the recovery?
A lot of people are still suffering. A lot of working families are still feeling the pinch, if you will. And I think the vast bulk of the conversations that I have, I spoke to a guy yesterday who is working, he's a truck driver, his wife works in the healthcare services. And what he's telling me is, look, he's got 2 teenage kids, he's thinking about the future, but he doesn't have that cushion, if you will, at the moment because of his weekly income. Even though there have been changes to the universal social charge in the 2015 budget, he's still feeling the pinch. So I think one of the areas that we really need to look at is the universal social charge, to see how we can ameliorate the conditions.
Or taking people out of it?
I think, quite frankly, I think in the future, we need to see the eventual demise of the universal social charge as a feature of Irish taxation policy. Okay, and if you look at what we did in 2015, we've taken 80,000 people out of the universal social charge. Since 2011, we actually took 410,000 people out of the universal social charge. The other thing, and very often people don't remember this or don't recall this or realise this, we did not introduce the universal social charge, but we've done a hell of a job of taking a lot of people out of it. Now, to go back to the question, to go back to Gina's question, and if we talk about working families and if we talk about people who are squeezed, I think we need to do more in 2016 to see if we can ameliorate for those people their take-home pay. They need to see more in their pay packets, because it could be the difference between putting a new set of tyres on the car, fixing the boiler, maybe touching up the house that hasn't been done since 2008 because of the kicking in of the recession.
But you accept that there is a lag in the economy in terms of people's feeling that they're part of something that's growing.
I think there is a latency about that. There's no question about it. But I think this year, people are realizing, for the first time, they're getting something back. And even though there's an additionality in terms of the charges that they face, we're keeping ahead of those charges by virtue of the measures that we've done in relation to the higher rates of income tax, for instance, and also in relation to improving the universal social charge. And also, bear in mind, the increases in child benefit as well. It's the beginning of a process of returning back monies to people who have made the ultimate sacrifice since 2008.
And on that note, we might come back to you on it. So there was one question I wanted to come back to you on, but I wanted to bring in Michael McCarthy because, it's all very well talking about, we've always been talking about this divide between, rural Ireland and urban areas, and is it about across-the-board taxation, or is it much more complex than that? For people to feel, we're talking about people feeling the recovery rather than perhaps talking about the statistics.
Yes, so I think in reality, people will only begin to feel the recovery when they feel it in their pockets. And there's a number of ways that government can do that in the next budget, based largely on the work in terms of fixing the economy. And as previous speakers have quite rightly pointed out, the universal social charge is one of those measures. That was an extremely punitive tax brought in by a previous government of independence and Fianna Fáil and whatever you're having yourself. Now, I want to see Labour further address the issue of the universal social charge in the coming budget, because these are the people who made the contribution for the recovery. Now, once you do that, and once you follow on the good work from exempting people from it, and you continue the process, insofar as economic circumstances can allow that, because ironically it's because of the sacrifices that have been made that puts us in a position to put money back in people's pockets through the USC. Now, this government, I think, will forever go down in history for sending the Troika back to where they came from. And I think the next instalment of that process to put money back in people's pockets is to send the universal social charge with them. And that would be a clear objective of mine.
Let me bring in Eamon Maloney. Eamon, you come from the same place as Martina, the questioner, Tallaght, so just talking about a particular area that has got complexity of problems and issues around social disadvantage, some vulnerable groups, and some very big growth as well. So what would you like to see in Budget 2016?
I think Labour, the Labour movement, the broad Labour movement, the party and trade unions, I think we would all be at one in relation to the upcoming budget, and that is that it should be a budget which eases as much pain from those who have suffered the most during the recession, and that it would be could be described as a caring budget. as been said by other people, there's a lot of people who find themselves on welfare that never set about in life to end up on welfare, lost their jobs, etc. And those are the people I think that should take priority in this thing, in the area of social welfare, particularly families with young children. And I know we've got a lot of criticism over the child benefit issue, but in fairness to the Taoiseach, she has restored part of the payment, and hopefully the other part of that payment that was taken away from the third and fourth child will be restored. And in fact, it's a measure of a great deal of the narrative about what happened with Labour in government and what happened to social welfare. A great deal of it talks about what was taken away or reduced. No one talks about all the things that the Taoiseach saved and protected, very seldom. And secondly, apart from those who are on welfare, it's already been alluded to, there would be across-the-board agreement, the phasing out of the universal social charge, introduced by the people who destroyed this country, its economy, who exported half the young people of this country to Canada and Australia, etc., who shouldn't...
I'm getting that loud and clear.
Yes.
I just want to bring in Michael McNamara from Scariff and Clare, so we're going from Tallaght to Clare. So my guess is, when I talk about different shades of the recovery in Ireland, that it's felt in different ways around the country. So what does it feel like for you guys over in Clare?
I mean, I think people aren't feeling it in their pockets yet in Clare, but the live register is clearly indicating a recovery. I mean, unemployment, the live register dropped by 10% last year in Clare, and that's a huge drop. And I think one of the initiatives which was very significant in that was one of the earlier government initiatives, which was to reduce the VAT rate on tourism products to 9%. And that was retained in the last budget. Those who criticised it at the time were calling for its retention last year, but are still criticising the alternative measures that have to be put in place to raise revenue. Tourism is hugely important in Clare, as it is throughout the western seaboard of Ireland. It's for that reason that I suppose we're putting down a motion on Shannon Airport.
Michael,
and the effect
pretty
that an
similar
Aer Lingus
to
sale would
Arthur,
have.
I guess.
Sorry?
Probably pretty similar to Arthur in terms of his acronym team, you know?
Yeah, I think so. But I mean, the next, I think, challenge we have now is to make sure that those who've been employed in tourism, many of whom are the precarious that are talked about, very few of whom are in the top decile of earners, that they start to feel it in their pockets. I mean, one of the reasons I joined the Labour Party wasn't just because of its progressive social policies, which of course I support, but our progressive economic policies. And by progressive, I mean that those who can afford to pay most in taxation do, and those who can afford to pay least don't.
We see that in the budget.
We need to make sure that the cumulative effect of our budgets since we came into office is progressive. Last year's budget was heavily criticised for not being progressive, but if you look at the statistics, it was a progressive budget. The next one needs to be to ensure that the cumulative effect is progressive. And finally, you talked about what risks are there to economic recovery. I mean, corporate crime hurts. Crime hurts, and we all hear that, but corporate crime hurts as well. And, you know, notwithstanding what this country has been through, I'm not convinced that our country is properly equipped to deal with the issue of corporate crime.
Okay,
and
that's
probably
another day's work, but you're absolutely right. Jed, I want to come to you finally. So I'm omnipotent, I'm all-powerful. I'm going to give you 3 wishes. So your 3 wishes are, what 3 things do we need to do in the next budget to guarantee that Labour is re-elected as part of the coalition?
Okay, well, I think what we'd like to see is the type of adjustments made to the
universal
social charge that I think all of us here would like to see. I mean, it was, I think, a very blunt instrument at the time, and I think it needs to be progressively reduced and ultimately abandoned. It's not just about the budget. For me, it's about making sure that we create a social democratic future. That's why I'm bringing in collective bargaining legislation. That's why I'm bringing in wage-setting mechanisms to have a fair recovery. When we speak about fair and balanced recovery, we don't just mean ensuring that there are job growth in the regions, but to make sure that people right across the socio-economic spectrum of this country get the benefit from the fruits of our hard-won economic recovery.
Okay, well, the wishes are granted. That's all we have time for, and maybe Labour Party Deputy Leader Alan Kelly would do the final wrap-up. Thanks to all of you, to the panellists, the questioners, for all of you at home, for watching and tweeting. Keep the conversation going. #LP15. Over to you, Minister Kelly.
Thank you. Now, colleagues, we've spoken much about the recovery. Is it secured fully? No. Has it been felt by every community? Not yet. Will it? Well, that's the Labour Party challenge, as we all know. The Irish people, through their sacrifices, have done the first steps of a full economic recovery and getting towards full employment. And our future prospects, colleagues, are better. And they're better because of the Labour Party. But it's no longer just about offering people a job, as we've heard there. It's about giving them a job and offering them a living wage. A job that gives people a break from their bills, a job that ensures that they can pay their bills but feel comfortable in their living. It is the Labour Party, and it is only the Labour Party, that is driving that agenda. And how do we do that? So that we can offer more than rhetoric, offer more than protest, and offer more than just promises. We do that by giving people concrete examples of progress and how we are going to develop. In my own department, through the 4 billion investment in housing and nearly 5 billion investment in water infrastructure and a further $250 million investment in rural development. Colleagues, that's 9 billion investment that is going to go out the length and breadth of this country. And do you know how many jobs that's going to create? 70,000 jobs to 2020. Now that's real, and that's going to have a real impact on people's lives. And what will that deliver? These works will provide homes for those who can't afford them to deal with the housing crisis. It will provide water for the next generation. The right to water. Well, what about the right to water for future generations? That's what I believe in. I believe in the right to water for our future children. In the coming weeks, I and my colleagues will be demonstrating how this is having an impact across the whole country. And yes, we will be dealing in the future with the whole issue of rent. There is a need for a new framework in relation to rent in this country, and it is the biggest priority for me and one of the biggest priorities for the government, for the Labour Party in government over the remaining tenure of our years in government. So, colleagues, let's focus in on the narrative of what the Labour Party needs to achieve. Let's take on our critics. Let's hold our achievements and ensure they're not stolen from us. And let's take the fight to our enemies. Let's rip them apart and rip apart their policies, which is just full of utopian rhetoric. And the big difference between the Labour Party and our enemies is the following. We take responsibility. We will never lead people up to the top of the hill and abandon them like many of the people we'll see outside our doors here this weekend in Killarney. Because ultimately, colleagues, the Labour Party is the party of work.